Victoria tapped a spoon against her champagne glass, just as Grace set the bread pudding in the center of the Christmas table. "My turn," my sister announced, rising beneath the gold garland she had ordered the staff to hang across the private dining room. "As of January, I will be the new Chief Operating Officer of Price House Restaurants." Everyone cheered. My father lifted his glass, and my mother clapped until her bracelets chimed. Even the cousins who had spent the evening complaining about their bonuses suddenly looked proud to share Victoria's last name. Grace slipped quietly into the empty chair beside me. She had been in the kitchen for most of dinner, helping Rosa finish the dessert she had spent 3 weeks perfecting. Across the table, Michael leaned toward her. "Is that the apprenticeship you were telling me about?" he asked, pointing to the folded brochure beside her plate. "The one where you work in a real kitchen instead of taking 4 years of business classes?" Grace smiled. "You should choose the life you actually want, not the one everyone already printed your name on." Victoria heard her. Her smile disappeared so quickly that the whole room seemed to cool. "Michael," she snapped. He looked up. She pointed at Grace as if my daughter had spilled something on the linen. "Don't talk to her. You might catch her poverty." For 1 second, no one moved. Then my uncle laughed, and one cousin covered her mouth. My mother gave the soft, nervous chuckle she always used when she wanted cruelty to pass as humor. Victoria smiled again, pleased with herself. Grace stared at the dessert she had made for them, her fingers folded around the edge of her napkin, small and careful, the same way they had closed around a paper-wrapped dinner the first day I met her 8 years earlier. Then she looked at me. "Mom?" she asked quietly. "Should I tell them?" Victoria let out a sharp laugh. "Tell us what? What could either of you possibly know?" I looked around the room. I looked at the restaurant my company had kept out of foreclosure, at the relatives whose paychecks had been guaranteed through North Table, and at the Christmas lights, paid for by a renovation fund I had approved 6 months earlier. Then I looked at my sister. "North Table Foods is mine," I said. "The company that bought Price House's debt, kept your insurance active, and owns 62% of this restaurant belongs to me." The laughter stopped. Victoria's champagne glass slipped against her fingers. "And that promotion you just celebrated," I added, "has never been approved." Before I tell you what my family did next, I hope you are having a peaceful day. Stay with me to see how this Christmas changed everything. And please subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the rest of our story. For several seconds, the only sound came from the dining room below us. Plates struck tables, a child laughed, and the old brass bell beside the kitchen doors rang for a server. Price House was still serving Christmas dinner, while my family sat upstairs trying to decide whether I had lost my mind. Victoria recovered first. "That is not funny. I am not joking. You expect us to believe you own North Table?" She looked around the table, waiting for someone to join her disbelief. "You work from a spare bedroom and drive a 10-year-old SUV. I work from home because I can. I drive that car because it still runs." My father lowered his glass. "North Table Recovery is an investment company. It is a company I control." "That is impossible," Victoria said. "I have dealt with North Table executives for years." "You dealt with the people I hired to run day-to-day operations. That did not make them the owners." Grace remained beside me with both hands in her lap. No one had apologized to her. No one had even looked at her since the words North Table Foods left my mouth. Victoria leaned across the table. "Prove it." I did not open a presentation or begin reciting legal documents. I pulled out my phone, found the ownership summary Daniel had sent after the most recent board review, and placed the screen in front of my father. My name appeared beneath North Table Foods and North Table Recovery Partners as controlling owner. Below that sat the line showing Recovery Partners' 62% interest in Price House Restaurants. My father read it twice. His face changed, but not in the way I had once imagined. There was no gratitude and no sudden recognition of the years I had spent solving problems from rooms no one noticed. His first question was, "Are you planning to take the restaurants away from us?" My mother pressed a hand to her chest. Evelyn, how could you deceive your own family for 8 years? Victoria snatched the phone from the table and scanned the screen. This does not give you the right to humiliate me at Christmas. I looked at Grace. She had made the dessert cooling between us. She had polished the serving spoon because the silver had been spotted. She had checked whether my father's portion contained nuts and whether my mother's sauce had too much sugar. They had accepted every small act of care from her, then laughed when Victoria called her poverty contagious. Yet somehow, in their minds, I was the one who had ruined Christmas. Grace was humiliated, I said. You were corrected. Victoria's cheeks darkened. I made one joke. You told your son that speaking to my daughter could contaminate him. Margaret reached for my wrist. Your sister did not mean it that way. Everyone is emotional. Sit down, and we can talk like a family. Grace's shoulders tightened at the word family. Michael finally spoke. Mom heard us talking about school. Grace did not tell me to do anything. Victoria turned on him. Stay out of this. You made it about me. Enough, my father said. He looked at me, not Victoria. If you own the majority, then what happens to the COO position? It requires approval from the majority owner. And you will not approve it? Victoria demanded. I have not reviewed it. You just said it was not approved in front of everyone. Because it is not. She pushed back her chair. You waited until tonight to announce this because you could not stand seeing me succeed. I nearly answered her. 8 years of silence crowded behind my teeth. I could have told them how close Price House had come to missing payroll, how quickly the bank had been preparing to move, and how many nights I had spent rebuilding a business whose public face still belonged to Victoria. But Grace's hand had disappeared beneath the table. She was gripping the strap of her small overnight bag, the one she carried even when we were only driving 20 minutes from home. That bag decided for me. We are leaving, I said. Victoria stepped into my path. You cannot drop something like this and walk out. I can walk out when my daughter has been insulted, and no one in this room has asked whether she is all right. The table went quiet again. My mother opened her mouth, but even then she looked toward my father first, as if checking which version of peace he preferred. Grace stood. She did not touch the bread pudding. No one else had either. We passed the kitchen doors, where Rosa looked up from a tray of plates. Her eyes moved from Grace's face to mine, and she asked no questions. She simply placed Grace's coat around her shoulders and squeezed them once. Downstairs, customers ate beneath the garlands. Servers hurried between tables. People whose health insurance and holiday pay depended on decisions I had made smiled at guests who would never know how close Price House had come to disappearing. Outside, snow had begun to dust the parking lot. Grace walked beside me without crying. That frightened me more than tears would have. Inside the car, I started the engine, but she did not fasten her seatbelt. She lifted the small overnight bag from the floor and placed it on her lap. I had seen that bag in foster homes, hospital waiting rooms, and beside her bedroom door during the first year she lived with me. I had told myself she carried it now from habit. Looking at her hands curled around the straps, I knew better. Grace stared through the windshield. Were you ever going to tell them? She asked. Or were you waiting to see how long I could keep earning my place? The restaurant glowed behind us, warm and golden against the snow. For the first time that night, I understood that the real crisis was no longer inside it. Grace's question stayed between us all the way home. I drove through streets edged with Christmas lights while she sat with the overnight bag on her lap. She did not ask me to explain again. She had spent too many years making it easy for adults to avoid difficult answers, and I could feel her refusing to do that for me now. When we reached the bungalow, I found a white pastry box on the rear floor. Rosa must have slipped it into the car while I was helping Grace with her coat. Inside was the untouched bread pudding, still arranged in the dish Grace had carried upstairs so carefully. Grace took the box from me without speaking. In the kitchen, she set out 4 small containers and began dividing the pudding into equal portions. She wrapped each one, pressed the lids down, then reached for a marker to write the date across the top. She had not tasted a single bite. The sight of her separating food before taking any for herself pulled me back 8 years, to the first Saturday I met her. North Table had funded a weekend cooking program for children in foster care. I had gone to inspect the kitchen, check the safety procedures, and make sure the grant was being used for more than a cheerful photograph in an annual report. Grace was 9 then, a thin girl with sleeves pulled over her hands and eyes that watched every adult before she touched anything. That morning, the children made chicken soup and warm rolls. When the others began eating, I saw Grace slide one roll and half her chicken into a paper napkin. She folded it tightly and pushed it beneath the zipper of her backpack. I did not ask whether she was hungry. The answer was already in the speed of her hands. "Paper will soak through," I told her. "Let me find you something better." She froze, certain she had been caught stealing. "It isn't for me." "I believe you." After a long silence, she told me there was a little boy in her foster home with a fever. He had missed breakfast because his stomach hurt, and she thought he might eat later. I found 2 clean containers, filled one for him, and filled the other for her. Grace stared at the second box. "I already ate some." "That does not mean you stop needing dinner." She did not thank me. She only held both containers against her chest, as if someone might change the rules before she reached the door. In my kitchen 8 years later, she was still dividing what she had made for other people before allowing herself any. "Grace, leave one out for yourself," I said. Her hand stopped over the last container. "I'm not hungry. You worked on that recipe for 3 weeks. That doesn't make me hungry." She put the final lid in place and faced me. "Why didn't you tell them?" There was no safe version of the answer left. "When Price House was failing, your grandfather would not have taken money from me. Not if he knew it was mine." "You don't know that." I knew him. The bank was preparing to move against the restaurants. Payroll was in danger, vendors were shortening their terms, and the insurance account was behind. I had days, not months, to make a deal. "So you hid behind another company." I used North Table Recovery because the business needed decisions made without every one of them becoming a family argument. Your grandfather could not call an investment company during dinner and demand an exception. Victoria could not turn every operating rule into a fight between sisters. Grace nodded once. She understood the logic. That made what came next harder. "And after the company was stable?" she asked. I looked at the neat row of containers between us. "At first, I kept waiting for the right time. Then you came to live with me." Her expression changed. "What did that have to do with Price House?" I knew how they saw money. I knew what they would see if they learned North Table was mine. You would not just be my daughter. You would be the girl who might inherit it. So, I wanted them to know you without that. I wanted to know whether they could love you because you were you, not because being close to you might benefit them someday. Grace stared at me so steadily that I heard the refrigerator motor click off behind her. "Then they were your test, Mom," she said. But I was the one taking it. I opened my mouth with an explanation already forming. I wanted to tell her that I had tried to protect her, that I had feared false affection more than open rejection, that I had never imagined Victoria would say something so ugly in front of everyone. Every sentence would have asked Grace to make my intentions more important than her experience. She turned away and slid the containers into the refrigerator. "Do you know how many times Grandma called me lucky?" I did, but I let her continue. "She said I was lucky you chose me. Aunt Victoria said I was surprisingly well behaved considering where I came from. People asked whether I remembered my real mother while you were standing right beside me. I sat there knowing the building, the jobs, the food on the table, all of it existed because of you. I still smiled because you asked me to keep the secret. I should never have put that on you. You told me because of the emergency papers." 2 years earlier, Daniel had insisted that Grace be told enough to understand what would happen if I became ill or died. She had been 15, old enough to sign the acknowledgement attached to my estate plan, but far too young to carry the consequences into every family gathering. "I told you that you never had to earn the right to stay with me," she said. "Then I spent every holiday trying to be useful enough for them to want me there. I saw you helping. I thought it made you feel included. It made them comfortable." Her voice remained quiet, which hurt more than if she had shouted. "There's a difference." My phone began vibrating against the counter. My mother's name appeared first, followed by my father's, then Victoria's. Grace glanced at the screen and stepped back. "I can explain to them tomorrow," I said. She gave me a tired look. "You still think explaining is the emergency?" I turned the phone face down. Grace picked up her overnight bag. For one frightened second, I thought she was leaving. She saw it in my face. "I'm staying here," she said. "I just need you not to follow me." She walked down the hall and closed her bedroom door. A moment later, the lock clicked. I stood in the kitchen beside 4 containers of bread pudding and understood how often I had mistaken physical safety for belonging. The calls continued. My father left 2 voicemails. My mother sent a message asking me not to let one unfortunate joke destroy the family. Several relatives wanted to know whether their jobs were safe. No one asked how Grace was. Victoria waited longer than the others. Her message arrived after midnight. "You owe this family an explanation before the investors hear your version." I read it twice. She had not written before this. My laptop was still on the dining table where I had left it that afternoon. I opened it and found an email Daniel had forwarded less than an hour earlier. The subject line read, "Price House Family Buyback. Final owner consent required." A deadline appeared at the top of the attached page. 12 days. Victoria was not only afraid that I had embarrassed her at Christmas. She was afraid I had exposed something she needed completed before I had time to look closely. I read the summary twice, before calling Daniel. The proposal was simple enough once I stripped away the polished language. Victoria wanted a lender to finance the family's purchase of the 62% of Price House owned by North Table Recovery. She intended to present herself as the new chief operating officer, with Michael positioned as the beginning of a stable 3rd generation. The lender had been told the family was united, succession was settled, and the current owner was prepared to support the sale. Only one of those claims was even partly true. Daniel answered on the first ring. "I wondered how long it would take you. Why am I seeing this 12 days before they expect my consent?" He exhaled slowly. Daniel had represented North Table Recovery publicly from the beginning. To my parents, he was the calm investment manager who attended quarterly reviews and refused to be pulled into family arguments. To me, he was the man who had warned me 8 years earlier that secrecy could solve an immediate problem while creating a more painful one later. Victoria said the owner would agree once the financing was ready, he told me. Her exact words were that no investor wants to hold a family restaurant chain forever. She never asked. She believed she did not need to. Frank and Margaret signed a letter supporting her promotion and the family succession plan. Victoria used it to show the lender that Price House would remain under experienced family leadership. My father could not promote Victoria without approval from the majority owner. He could give her a new title, move her into an office, and order new business cards. He could not make the position legally effective. "Did you tell them her promotion was conditional?" Repeatedly. "And they ignored you." "They assumed the condition was a formality." I looked toward the hallway. Grace's bedroom door remained closed. The 4 containers of bread pudding were still in the refrigerator, untouched. "What happens if I refuse the sale?" "The proposed loan does not move forward. Victoria's promotion remains unapproved. Nothing else happens immediately." That last word mattered. "If I stop it, they will tell the employees I threaten the company." "They may. And if the restaurants lose confidence from vendors or staff, they will say I caused that too." Daniel did not rush to reassure me. "Evelyn, you are still trying to decide how much damage you should accept before anyone is allowed to blame you." His words brought back the last week Price House had belonged entirely to my parents. 8 years earlier, I had stood in my father's office while snow melted from my boots onto the worn carpet. Past due notices covered his desk. 2 major suppliers had moved the restaurants to cash on delivery. The payroll account would not cover another full cycle, and the bank had begun preparing to take control of the flagship property. I had already built North Table Foods into a strong regional supplier, but my family still described my work as the business I had chosen instead of them. Sell the Brookfield location, I told my father. It is underperforming, and the sale gives you enough room to stabilize the others. We are not carving up the company because you think you understand it better than I do. The bank will carve it up for you. He stood behind his desk, his face red with exhaustion and pride. You walked away from this family business. You do not get to come back and clean up the consequences like the rest of us were waiting for you. I had not walked away because I hated Price House. I had left because every improvement I suggested became an insult to my father, and every problem I solved became part of Victoria's public success. Still, I tried once more. Let North Table buy the debt. You keep operating control while we restructure. His answer came without hesitation. I will close every location before I let my daughter own me. 3 days later, I returned to the foster cooking program where I had met Grace. She was 9 then. The week before, I had watched her hide food for a younger child in her foster home. That Saturday, she dropped a mixing bowl. It shattered across the tile, and she went completely still. The other children stepped back. Grace stared at the broken pieces as if they were proof that she had used up her welcome. I can clean it, she said. You don't have to call anyone. I handed her a broom but kept my hand over the sharpest pieces. A bowl can be replaced. Your hands cannot. She looked at me with the suspicion of a child who had heard kind words before and learned to wait for the condition attached to them. That week, I saw the same failure in 2 different places. A business employing nearly 200 people was about to collapse because my father considered accepting help more humiliating than losing everyone's livelihood. A child was terrified that breaking one bowl might cost her the right to return because too many adults had treated care as something temporary. In both places, the people with power were protecting their pride, while those with less power absorbed the risk. I stopped asking my father for permission. North Table Recovery purchased the bank's secured debt and provided the capital necessary to cover payroll, insurance, and supplier obligations. In exchange, the holding company received 62% ownership of Price House. The transaction was legal, documented, and explained to my parents. They knew they had lost majority control. They knew Daniel represented the new owner. They simply did not know I was behind it. At first, the secrecy was necessary. If my father had known the buyer was me, he might have allowed the restaurants to fail rather than sign. By placing Daniel between us, I created rules my family could not dismiss, as another daughter telling them what to do. Budgets had to be followed. Family vendors had to submit real bids. Personal expenses could no longer disappear into restaurant accounts. Later, the reason changed. When Grace came to live with me, I imagined what would happen if they knew North Table was mine. They would stop seeing a child from foster care and start seeing a possible heir. Every invitation, birthday gift, and affectionate word would become impossible to trust. I told myself I was protecting her from false love. The truth was less flattering. I was also protecting myself from confrontation. I liked being able to save everyone without standing in front of them and asking whether they respected me. I accepted holiday invitations as proof that we were still a family, even when Grace was treated as someone who should remain grateful for being included. I had hidden behind Daniel for so long that Grace had been forced to hide beside me. Evelyn, he said, bringing me back to the present. Victoria's title is not the urgent issue. The lender needs the majority owner's consent. You are being asked to approve the debt that would buy your own interest. I understand. Do you? I looked again at the financing summary. The purchase price depended on December revenue being stronger than any December Price House had reported in 5 years. I am not saying no yet. Daniel was silent. If the numbers are sound and the loan is survivable, I need to know that before I make this about Victoria. That is fair. And if they are not sound, I need to know whether she understands what she submitted. What do you want from me? Nothing beyond the documents already provided. I am not sending anyone to dig through her office. I only need 3 answers. Are the numbers wrong? Does Victoria know? And what happens to the employees if I sign? After we ended the call, Grace opened her bedroom door. She did not come into the kitchen. She stood in the hallway holding her phone. Michael texted me, she said. I waited. He apologized. He said he never wanted to run Price House, and his mother has been telling people he does. Are you going to answer him? Not yet. She returned to her room, but this time, she left the door partly open. I turned back to the documents. The revenue summary showed 14 large catering events credited to December. I opened the Price House catering calendar to see which locations had hosted them. Every event was listed. Every deposit had been received. Every service date fell in January. I was at the Brookfield Price House before the first prep cook arrived. The side entrance still opened with the same brass key I had carried in my 20s, back when my father called whenever a refrigerator failed, a delivery went missing, or 2 servers had been scheduled for the same shift. Victoria had always been better at greeting donors and remembering reporters' names. I had been the daughter in the back office, counting inventory, rewriting schedules, and calling suppliers until someone extended our terms. The kitchen smelled of bleach, onions, and yesterday's coffee. Stainless steel counters reflected the pale winter light. Those early mornings had taught me how to build North Table. They had also taught my family that I would solve whatever they refused to see. I set 3 things on the prep table: the December revenue summary, the January catering calendar, the deposit slips connected to the 14 events listed on both. Rosa came through the swinging doors, carrying a grocery bag, and stopped when she saw me. She had worked at Price House for 26 years and now ran the dessert kitchen. Her gray hair was pinned beneath a scarf, and flour marked one cuff of her coat. Is Grace all right? She asked. Rosa was the first person since Christmas dinner who had asked about my daughter before asking about the company. She is home, I said. She is hurt, and she has every reason to be. Rosa's mouth tightened. What Victoria said was cruel. You heard? Half the kitchen heard. Private rooms are never as private as families think. I looked at the empty pastry station where Grace had spent most of Christmas afternoon. She thought that if the dessert was good enough, Victoria might put it on the winter menu. That girl has been trying to feed people who keep forgetting to make room for her. I had no answer that would not sound like another excuse. I turned the January calendar toward her. I need help understanding these events. Rosa glanced at the page. The Whitmore wedding, the hospital foundation dinner, 3 retirement banquets, and the university reception. What about them? Have any taken place? No. The first is January 4th. Are all the deposits non-refundable? She shook her head. Some contracts allow cancellation until 10 days before service. The university can reduce its guest count until the week before. I showed her the December summary. 14 deposits had been presented as completed catering revenue. The total made December look stronger than any month Price House had reported in years. Rosa frowned. We have not even bought the food for most of those events. I called Daniel and put him on speaker. I asked one question. What does the lender believe this number represents? His answer was immediate. Earned December revenue from completed or substantially completed services. Rosa stared at the deposit slips. The services have not happened, I said. Several can still be canceled or reduced. Then the presentation is not describing the company's current position accurately, Daniel replied. I ended the call before it turned into a review of every page. I already had the first answer. The numbers were wrong. Rosa began placing breakfast pastries onto sheet pans, but her movements had lost their rhythm. They changed vendor payments, too. How? 2 seafood invoices and the December linen bill were moved to the second week of January. We were told the bank wanted the year-end accounts to look cleaner. Who told you that? The regional office. Victoria's name was copied. The deposits pulled money forward. The delayed bills pushed obligations away. I did not need a forensic accountant in the kitchen to understand the picture they were selling. Rosa slid a tray into the oven. My husband starts another round of treatment next month. His medication comes through my insurance here. I had approved the plan renewal that kept his specialist in network, though Rosa never knew my name was behind it. Many of us have been here longer than some managers, she continued. People hear buyback and expansion, and they think the family is strong again. They do not understand what happens if the payment is too large. On the wall hung a photograph from the restaurant's 30th anniversary. Rosa stood in the second row beside dishwashers, servers, cooks, and hosts whose names never appeared in family speeches. Victoria's proposal treated their paychecks as proof that she deserved control. If the projections failed, those same paychecks would become the first place the company searched for cash. I am not closing these restaurants, I told Rosa. Then do not sign something, because your family is afraid of you saying no. I called Victoria. She answered with, "Are you finally ready to explain yourself? I am at Brookfield. Meet me in the kitchen. I am not being summoned to one of my own restaurants. It is not yours, and this is not a conversation I will have over the phone." She arrived 40 minutes later in the cream coat she had worn at Christmas, though the gold pin announcing her new title was gone. Rosa had moved to the front pastry station, leaving us alone with the documents. Victoria did not look at them. Mother cried all night. Grace did not cry at all. She is 17. She will survive a joke. This meeting is not about the joke. Of course it is. You waited until I announced my promotion, then used your daughter to make me look like a monster. I pushed the December summary toward her. Why are deposits for 14 January events listed as December revenue? Her gaze dropped for less than a second. Because the money was received in December. The service has not been provided. It will be. Some clients can still cancel or reduce their guest counts. That is how catering works. Does the lender know the events have not taken place? Victoria folded her arms. The lender has the totals it requested. That is not what I asked. She walked to the coffee station, found the pot empty, and set the cup down with unnecessary force. You built $100 million company, she said. Do not pretend you have never presented numbers in the strongest possible light. I have never called unearned revenue earned. It is a timing adjustment. January will catch up after the events happen. And if two cancel, they will not. You cannot know that. She turned back to me. This buyback gives our parents their company back. It gives the employees certainty. It keeps the price name where it belongs. It also puts a new loan payment ahead of payroll, vendors, and insurance. You do not care about those people more than I do. I care enough not to ask them to carry a loan based on money the company has not earned. Victoria's expression changed. The wounded sister disappeared, and the operator beneath her stepped forward. If you refuse, everyone will learn how you waited until Dad was desperate, bought the company through a shell, and hid it for 8 years. They will hear that you kept Grace close while building her into your replacement for Michael. You will not look like a rescuer. You will look like a woman who stole her family's name and chose an adopted daughter to inherit it. The words were designed with care. Victoria had already found the story she intended to tell. Not that she had misrepresented revenue. Not that she had used Michael in a succession plan he did not want. Not that she had laughed while humiliating Grace. Her story would be about my betrayal, my secrecy, and the outsider daughter I had supposedly placed above blood. She opened her folder and removed the owner consent pages. Then she laid them over the calendar, covering every January date with white paper. Victoria placed a pen on the steel table and pushed it toward me. "Sign it," she said, "and no one has to lose anything." I looked at the pen, but did not touch it. I left the pen where Victoria had placed it. "I will not sign anything in this kitchen," I said. "Daniel will conduct a formal review, and I want the complete supporting records." Her mouth tightened. "You already decided before I walked in. I decided not to certify numbers I know are misleading. You are punishing everyone because I embarrassed Grace. If this were only about Christmas, we would be discussing an apology. We are discussing a loan that could endanger 180 paychecks." Victoria gathered the consent pages, but I placed my hand over the folder before she could close it. "This copy comes with me. It belongs to Price House. It was prepared for my signature as the controlling owner." For a moment, I thought she might pull it from beneath my hand. Instead, she stepped back and gave me the polished smile she used when a reporter asked an inconvenient question. "Take it," she said. "By tonight, everyone will know exactly how you became the controlling owner." She kept that promise. My father called before I reached home. I answered through the car speakers, hoping the physical distance would help me remain calm. "Did you wait until we were weak so you could buy back your own name?" he demanded. "Dad, the bank was preparing to take the company. You hid behind strangers. I used a legal holding company because you told me you would close every restaurant before accepting help from me. You bought our debt when we had no leverage. I bought it when no other buyer was offering terms that kept you operating." He did not deny that. He simply moved past it. "You waited for your family to fall, then purchased the right to control us. If I had waited, there would be no Price House. You always needed to prove you were smarter than everyone else." The old accusation still found its mark. I had heard versions of it since my 20s. When I found waste, I was criticizing. When I prevented a loss, I was showing off. When Victoria stood in front of a repaired problem and accepted praise, she was protecting the family name. "I did not buy the name," I said. "I protected the employees, the locations, and the obligations you could no longer meet. That name was never yours to protect." The line went silent after he disconnected. Margaret called next. Her voice was softer, which made the pressure more difficult to resist. "Your father is devastated. Has anyone asked how Grace is?" "Of course we care about Grace, but first we need to stop this business situation from getting worse." The order of her words told me everything. "Victoria called what happened a joke," I said. "You laughed." I was uncomfortable. People laugh when they are uncomfortable. Grace was the only person in the room expected to absorb that discomfort without reacting. "We can address what Victoria said after you sign the papers. Once the restaurants are safely back with the family, we can sit down, apologize, and put Christmas behind us." I gripped the steering wheel. "You want me to risk the company first, then discuss my daughter if there is time left?" "That is not what I said." "It is exactly what you said. Evelyn, please do not destroy your father's legacy over one cruel sentence. The loan documents are misleading. That has nothing to do with whether Victoria apologizes." Margaret began crying. I listened for a few seconds before understanding that even her tears were asking me to return to my usual role. I was supposed to quiet everyone, repair the damage, and accept the part of the blame that made peace possible. "I am not signing today," I said. "Do not ask me again." By the time I arrived home, Victoria had called 2 regional managers and several relatives who held supervisory jobs. She told them North Table had been Evelyn all along, and that I was considering taking Price House away from the family. She did not mention the January deposits. She did not mention the delayed vendor bills. She told a simpler story. I had secretly purchased the company during a crisis, concealed my control for 8 years, then revealed it at Christmas because I resented her promotion. Daniel called as I carried the folder into my dining room. 3 managers have asked whether North Table plans to close locations, he said. On what basis? Victoria told them you may withdraw support unless the family gives up the buyback. I never threatened to withdraw anything. I know. They do not. I looked at the folder in my hand. Victoria was using the same people whose jobs made the loan dangerous as leverage to force me to approve it. Tell them operations continue normally, I said. No location is closing, payroll is not being interrupted, and employee benefits remain active. I can send that in writing. Do it without discussing the ownership dispute or the loan details. After the call, I found Grace at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She was not working on her apprenticeship application. Michael's name filled the top of her screen beside an active call. Victoria's voice came through the speakers. You will tell your grandparents that you intend to attend business school and join Price House after graduation. Michael sounded farther from the phone. I never agreed to that. You agreed every time you stood beside us at a company event. I was a kid. You are 18 now, which means it is time to stop embarrassing this family. Grace reached to mute her microphone when she saw me. Victoria continued, That girl has made you ashamed of ambition. Grace did not make me ashamed of anything. You were discussing culinary school with her at Christmas. I have wanted that for years. She is the first person who asked what I wanted instead of telling me. Michael, the lender needs confidence in the next generation. I am not signing anything that says I plan to run Price House. A sharp silence followed. You have no idea what is at stake, Victoria said. I know you insulted Grace because you thought she was changing my mind. She wasn't. You just never listened long enough to know I already had one. The call ended soon afterward. Grace closed the laptop. I didn't ask him to call me, she said. I know. He wanted me to hear him tell her. Did it help? Grace considered the question. I'm glad he finally said it. I still hate being the reason everyone is fighting. You are not the reason, but my name keeps becoming the weapon. Aunt Victoria says you chose me over blood. Michael says I helped him see the truth. Grandma says you should sign, so they can deal with what happened to me later. She looked at the folder I had placed on the counter. What are you going to do? I found deposits for January events, recorded as December revenue. Victoria wants me to sign a loan package based on those numbers. Then do not make your decision because she insulted me. The firmness in her voice surprised me. Grace, what she said matters. It matters to us. The loan has to be wrong, even if Christmas never happened. It is wrong. Then stop it because it is wrong. Do not let them say you risked everyone's jobs because you were an angry mother with money. She was asking more of me than revenge. She was asking me to separate my pain from my authority and still make the same decision. I need to verify the full risk, I said. Then everyone responsible for this proposal needs to answer for it in the same room. Grace glanced toward the hallway. Another family meeting? No. A formal member meeting. Ownership, management, the loan, and Victoria's promotion will be addressed on the record. I called Daniel and instructed him to preserve every document connected to the buyback, including revenue summaries, event schedules, vendor obligations, succession materials, and communications concerning owner consent. Then I directed him to convene a special member meeting before the lender's deadline. No more decisions through private phone calls, I told him. No more different stories for different people. When I finished, Grace was still watching me. I began arranging the documents into a single file. The catering calendar went first, followed by the revenue summary and the consent pages Victoria had pushed toward me. I kept the evidence simple enough that no one could hide behind language. Grace came to the other side of the table. She rested her fingers on the folder without opening it. When this is over, she asked, are you going to save them again? My hand stopped over the papers. For most of my life, the answer would have come automatically. This time, I could not give it. Grace's question followed me after she went to bed. Was I going to save them again? I had spent 8 years calling it protection whenever I stepped between my family and the consequences of their choices. I protected my father from losing the company, my mother from watching the family name disappear, Victoria from facing how badly the restaurants had been managed, and the employees from paying for mistakes they had not made. The person I had protected least was sleeping down the hall. I carried the financing folder to my bedroom, opened the closet, and reached for the overnight bag Grace had brought home from Christmas. I intended to put it on the top shelf where she would not have to see it. The zipper caught against something inside, and the bag fell open across the floor. A folded sweatshirt landed beside my foot. Under it were leggings, clean underwear, a toothbrush, travel-size soap, 2 days of medication, a phone charger, $40 in small bills, and copies of her identification and adoption papers, sealed in a plastic envelope. Nothing had been thrown together after Victoria's insult. Every item had been packed carefully and replaced often enough that the medication was current. Grace appeared in the doorway before I could put anything back. "I wasn't searching," I said. The bag opened. She looked at the contents on the floor without embarrassment. "I know how it looks. How long have you kept it packed?" "I don't know. Always, I guess. You have lived here for 6 years. You have been my daughter legally for 5. "I know." She knelt and returned the toothbrush to its side pocket. "I don't plan to leave. I just feel calmer when I know I could do it quickly." The answer took me back to the Foster cooking program, to the sound of ceramic breaking across a tile floor. Grace had been 9. A mixing bowl slipped from her wet hands and shattered at her feet. Every child in the room jumped, but Grace did not move, her face emptied. She stared at the pieces as though the bowl had not broken by accident, but had revealed something defective in her. "I can clean it," she said. "You don't have to call anyone." I moved the largest shard away from her shoes and gave her the broom. "We'll clean it together. Can I still come back next week?" That question had hurt me more than the broken bowl. I placed my hand over the sharp pieces before she could reach for them. "Bowls can be replaced. Your hands cannot." She had watched me through the entire cleanup, waiting for anger that never came. I believed consistency would eventually teach her that accidents did not end relationships. 5 years later, on the day her adoption became final, we sat in the car outside the courthouse with a paper bag of pastries between us. Grace wore a blue dress and kept touching the new certified copy of the adoption order. "What do I have to do now?" she asked. "To celebrate. Eat one before I finish both." "No. What do I have to do so you keep me forever?" I turned toward her. "Nothing." She studied my face as if one word could not possibly contain a permanent promise. "Nothing," I repeated. "You are my daughter when you are helpful and when you are difficult, when you agree with me and when you are angry. You do not have to earn this." Standing beside her packed bag in the present, I understood that I had made that promise, and then quietly placed conditions around the rest of her family. Grace zipped the plastic envelope closed. "After that, you told me the biggest secret in the family and asked me not to tell anyone. You needed to understand the estate documents. I know why you told me. But then we kept going to dinners where Aunt Victoria called me lucky. Grandma praised me for being grateful, and everyone treated me like I was visiting. I had to smile, while knowing they were living in something you saved. I should have stopped it. You should have stopped making me help you hide it." She was right, and a general apology would have been another way to avoid naming what I had done. "I protected your grandfather's pride because I was afraid he would destroy the restaurants rather than accept help from me," I said. "I protected your grandmother from admitting how much she had excused. I protected the stability of Price House because 180 families depended on it. After the emergency passed, I protected my own fear. I did not want to know whether they would pretend to love you for money, and I did not want to confront how poorly they treated you without it." Grace sat on the edge of the bed, holding the sweatshirt against her knees. "I protected all of that longer than I protected you," I continued. "I made you carry a secret, attend those holidays, and act grateful so I could keep believing the family was still intact. That was wrong. It was not your burden, and my reasons do not make the cost to you smaller." Her eyes filled, but she did not move toward me. "I'm glad you finally said it. I am sorry. I'm not ready to tell you it's okay. I am not asking you to. I need to see you do something different when they make you choose." The special member meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon in the room above the flagship dining room. Until that moment, I had assumed Grace would be there because the conflict had begun with her. I saw now how easily that assumption turned her into evidence. "Do you want to attend?" I asked. "You can say no. You can come for part of it, all of it, or none of it." Grace considered the choices carefully. I want to say one thing at the beginning. Then I want to leave with Rosa. I don't want to sit there while they argue about ownership like that explains what happened. What do you want to tell them? That they ate what I made. They let me work in the kitchen, remember birthdays, clean up, and make things easier for them. But the second Michael listened to me, Aunt Victoria acted like I could dirty his future. I want them to hear that before they start talking about money. A knock sounded at the front door. Michael stood on the porch in a hooded sweatshirt, his hands shoved into his pockets. He had driven over without Victoria. Grace led him into the living room, but remained standing. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have said something the moment she said it." "You should have," Grace replied. I didn't laugh. "You also didn't stop her." His gaze dropped. "I know." Grace's voice softened without releasing him from responsibility. "Your apology matters, but do not tell everyone you rejected Price House because of me. I am not your reason to fight your mother. I don't want business school. I don't want to run the restaurants. I've known that for years." "Then say that because it is your life." Michael nodded. He removed his phone and opened an email addressed to Daniel, Victoria, and my parents. Before sending it, he showed us the final sentence. "I withdraw my name and image from every Price House succession presentation and will not represent that I intend to join management." He pressed send. After he left, I called Daniel. I told him Grace would speak briefly at the start of the meeting and then leave. I also told him my position on the financing no longer depended on any vote concerning Victoria's title. "I will not sign a package built on false revenue," I said, "even if every other member supports her promotion." For the first time, I set the boundary before learning whether my family would forgive me for it. I opened my handbag and found the pen Victoria had pushed across the steel table. I had picked it up with the documents without noticing. I removed it and placed it beside Grace's packed bag. "Tomorrow I am not signing anything that asks you or those employees to pay for my family's pride." Daniel arrived at my house the morning before the special member meeting carrying one folder. "No binders," he said as he sat across from me at the kitchen table. "No financial lecture. Everything you need is on one page." Grace had left for a walk with Rosa. She had chosen what she wanted to say at the meeting, but she did not want to spend the day listening to adults prepare arguments about her family status. I had promised not to make her pain part of our evidence package. Daniel slid the summary toward me. 3 lines had been printed in bold. The first showed the proposed monthly loan payment. It was large enough that 1 week quarter could force Price House to use cash normally reserved for payroll. The second explained that the restaurants still relied on extended payment terms from several major food suppliers. If the company violated the lender's financial conditions, those suppliers could demand faster payment or move the restaurants back to cash on delivery. The third listed the expenses management would most likely examine during an emergency cost reduction. Employee insurance sat near the top. I thought of Rosa placing Grace's coat around her shoulders on Christmas night. Her husband's next treatment began in January. "If I sign this," I said, "Victoria gets the money to buy North Table Recovery's interest, but Price House inherits a debt it can only afford if her projections are right. That is the problem. And we already know part of those projections depends on January events being presented as December performance." Daniel nodded. "Some of those events may happen exactly as planned. That does not make the loan safe today." I placed the page flat against the table. "What protects the employees without leaving Victoria in control?" "We keep the current ownership structure for now. No buyback, no new debt. The restaurants continue operating under the existing managers who are not involved in the financing package. Victoria's financial authority can be suspended while an independent audit determines what happened." "What about the family?" "They retain their 38% interest and the retirement payments already guaranteed to your parents. Nothing needs to be seized, closed, or sold." I had expected the choice to feel more dramatic. Instead, it was painfully ordinary. The restaurants could continue serving customers, paying employees, and buying food. The only thing that had to stop immediately was Victoria's attempt to gain more power through misleading numbers. And after the audit? I asked. That depends on what it finds. You can begin a governance review, create clearer employee representation, or consider a longer-term ownership transition. You do not need to design the next 20 years before tomorrow afternoon. That mattered. I had spent my life believing that if I refused one rescue, I had to arrive with a perfect replacement. It was how people like Victoria kept women like me trapped. They created an emergency, then demanded that anyone who objected solve every possible consequence before being allowed to say no. I want a transparent governance process after the audit, I said. Not another arrangement built around who is related to whom. Daniel made a note. That is enough for tomorrow. The doorbell rang before he closed the folder. My parents stood on the porch together. My father looked smaller than he had at Christmas, but his anger had not weakened. Margaret carried a covered dish, as though arriving with food could make the visit familial instead of strategic. Daniel offered to leave. I asked him to stay. Frank noticed the single-page summary on the table. So this is a business meeting now? You came to discuss the signature. We came because this family has lost enough, Margaret said. Your father lost control of the company once. Victoria may lose the position she worked for. Michael is turning against his mother. Grace will not answer my messages. You sent Grace 3 messages asking her to convince me to sign. I told her she could help bring everyone back together. She is not responsible for repairing what happened. My father pulled out a chair. Sign the agreement, let the company return to the family, and then we can handle the personal issues privately. Do either of you remember how Grace looked after Victoria spoke to her? Margaret glanced down at the dish in her hands. Victoria did not mean it literally. Grace heard it literally. Michael heard it literally. Everyone who laughed taught her exactly where she stood. It was a bad joke, my mother insisted. You cannot judge an entire family by one uncomfortable moment. It was not one moment. It was the moment that made everything else impossible to ignore. Frank struck the table with the side of his hand. The sound made Daniel look up but did not startle me. Grace does not understand what Price House means, my father said. She did not grow up in those kitchens. She did not watch her mother and me sacrifice everything to build them. She has spent years in those kitchens. She learned recipes none of the grandchildren bothered to remember. She knows which employees have allergies, whose spouses are sick, and which dishwasher sends money to his mother every month. She worked through Christmas while the people carrying the Price name sat upstairs waiting to be served. That is not the same as belonging to the legacy. Why not? Because she came later. The words settled across the table. Margaret reached for his arm, but Frank continued. She should be grateful you gave her a family. Instead, she stands between sisters and encourages Michael to walk away from his responsibilities. Daniel lowered his eyes to the folder. He understood that the most important evidence in the room had nothing to do with accounting. Grace is my daughter, I said. She is not a charity project who owes this family obedience because I adopted her. That is not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant. You believe belonging was something I gave her, so she must keep proving she deserves it. Margaret's face crumpled. We welcomed her. You allowed her to serve you. That is not the same thing. My father pushed his chair back. If you refuse to sign, do not pretend this is about protecting employees. You are choosing Grace over your own family. There is no version of my family that excludes my daughter. They left the covered dish on the counter. Neither of them said goodbye to Daniel. Neither asked where Grace was or whether she wanted to speak with them. Victoria called less than 10 minutes after their car disappeared. I heard that went badly, she said. You sent them. I asked them to remind you what is at stake. You asked them to pressure me. I am offering you a way out. I will apologize to Grace in front of everyone. I will tell Michael I was wrong, and we will move forward as a family. In return, you sign the owner consent before tomorrow's meeting. For a moment, I could not speak. Victoria believed an apology was not something Grace deserved. It was currency, and she intended to exchange it for control of the company. You do not get to purchase my signature with words you should already have said. I am trying to compromise. A real apology does not come with a financing condition. Her voice sharpened. If this deal collapses, the employees will hear why. They will know you chose your daughter's wounded pride over their jobs. I am refusing to place their jobs beneath a loan built on revenue Price House has not earned. You think they will understand that distinction when they are afraid? I think you are counting on fear because the numbers cannot defend you. She hung up without confirming whether she would attend the meeting. That evening, Grace returned with Rosa and went directly to her room. I did not ask what they had discussed. I finished reviewing the one-page summary, placed it inside the meeting folder, and turned off the kitchen lights. As I walked toward my bedroom, I saw Grace's overnight bag against the hallway wall. It was no longer hidden inside her closet or clutched against her chest. The zipper remained closed, and everything was probably still packed inside. She had not thrown it away, and I did not expect her to. But she had left it in the hallway. For the first time since I had known her, Grace was not preparing to take it with her. The room above the flagship dining room looked smaller without Christmas decorations. 6 days earlier, Victoria had stood beneath gold garland and announced a promotion that did not legally exist. Now the garland was gone, but the long walnut table remained in the same position. Through the floor, I could hear silverware striking plates and servers moving between guests below us. Price House continued operating while the people who claimed to own its history gathered upstairs to decide who would bear the cost of protecting it. Daniel sat at one end of the table with a single folder. My parents took the chairs beside Victoria. Michael sat apart from them, close enough to be included but far enough to make his position clear. Rosa waited near the door. Grace stood beside me with her hands clasped in front of her. She had left the overnight bag at home. Daniel began to speak, but Grace touched my arm. I want to go first. Every face turned toward her. Victoria leaned back as though she had already been forced to tolerate too much. Grace did not sit. I made the bread pudding on Christmas, she said. I helped in the kitchen because Rosa needed another pair of hands. I checked Grandpa's dessert for nuts. I changed Grandma's sauce because she said the first one had too much sugar. I remembered what everyone needed, because that is what I always do when I come here. Margaret's expression softened, but Grace continued before she could interrupt. You call me helpful. You tell people I am well behaved. You say I am lucky Mom adopted me. You let me cook for you, clean up after you, remember your birthdays, and make myself useful. She looked directly at Victoria. But when Michael listened to me, you acted like where I came from was something that could infect him. Then everyone laughed. I already said it was a joke, Victoria replied. Grace did not raise her voice. A joke is supposed to be funny to someone besides the person saying it. Frank shifted in his chair. We all regret that the evening became uncomfortable. Grace looked at him. It did not become uncomfortable. Aunt Victoria made it cruel, and the rest of you made it safe for her. No one answered. I do not need an apology because my mother owns North Table, Grace said. What she said would still be wrong if Mom had no money, if we lived in a motel, or if I still carried everything I owned in one bag. Being poor is not a disease, and being adopted does not make me a guest who has to earn every meal. Margaret covered her mouth. For once, I did not move to comfort her. Grace turned to me. That is all I wanted to say. You do not have to stay, I told her. I know. Rosa opened the door and walked Grace downstairs. A few minutes later, she returned alone and resumed her place near the wall. I watched the door close and felt the difference between letting Grace choose and asking her to endure one more family confrontation for my sake. Michael cleared his throat. I also need something stated before the business discussion, he said. I have withdrawn my name and image from every succession presentation. Grace never told me to reject Price House. She was the first person who asked what I wanted, but I had already decided I did not want business school or a management position. Victoria stared at him. You have no idea what you are throwing away. That is my decision. You are 18. Old enough for you to use me in a loan presentation. Frank looked toward Daniel. Is that what this meeting is going to be? Children accusing their parents? This meeting concerns ownership, management authority, and the proposed buyback, Daniel said. Personal statements were permitted because those issues were used to support the succession plan. Victoria folded her hands on the table. Then let us discuss ownership. Evelyn secretly purchased the company while our parents were desperate. She hid behind North Table for 8 years, allowed us to believe we were rebuilding our own business, and revealed herself only when she wanted to destroy my promotion. I did not purchase Price House to destroy you, I said. You purchased our debt through a shell company. Daniel opened his folder. North Table Recovery Partners is a legitimate holding company, controlled by Evelyn Price. It purchased the secured debt and later received 62% ownership under the restructuring agreement signed by Frank and Margaret Price. My father looked at me. Tell us exactly what that means. It means North Table Recovery bought the debt that stopped the bank from foreclosing on the flagship property, I said. North Table provided the bridge money that covered payroll when Price House could not complete the next pay cycle. It kept the employee insurance account active and used North Table's supplier relationships to preserve credit terms when vendors were preparing to demand cash on delivery. Rosa remained silent, but her eyes did not leave my father. I continued. North Table also paid for the kitchen repairs, accessibility work, and renovations that kept 3 locations open. In exchange, the holding company received 62% ownership. Margaret looked around the room as if the walls themselves had changed. The renovations? She asked. Yes. The insurance? Yes. And all those years, Daniel came to the quarterly meetings. He represented the majority owner. Frank's voice dropped. Why did you not tell us? Because when I offered to help under my own name, you said you would close every restaurant before letting your daughter own you. His face hardened, but he did not deny it. I used the holding company because there was no time to argue, I continued. The bank was moving, payroll was short, and nearly 200 employees were carrying the risk of your pride. Keeping my name out of the transaction allowed the restructuring to happen. That explains the beginning, Michael said quietly. Not 8 years. He was right. After the emergency passed, I should have told everyone, I said. I did not. Part of me wanted to know whether this family could accept Grace without seeing her as a future heir. Part of me feared that any affection shown after the truth came out would be impossible to trust. Margaret looked wounded. You tested us? I told myself I was protecting Grace. In reality, I made her live inside that test. I also used secrecy to avoid confronting all of you. Saving the company was necessary. Continuing to hide behind North Table was not. Victoria gave a short, humorless laugh. So now we are supposed to praise your honesty, because you finally admitted you deceived us? No. You controlled our livelihoods while sitting at our holiday table pretending to be ordinary. I was ordinary at that table. Ownership did not make Grace's humiliation more serious. It only revealed how much this family was willing to accept from us while still treating her as lesser. Victoria looked toward my parents. This is exactly what I warned you about. She is turning a business acquisition into a moral performance. Daniel closed the ownership summary. The ownership structure is established, he said. The meeting must now address the proposed buyback, Miss Dalton's unapproved promotion, and the financial information submitted to the lender. Victoria straightened in her chair. The buyback returns Price House to the family that built it. The lender wants experienced management, clear succession, and proof that the company can support the debt. My promotion provides stability. Michael's involvement was meant to demonstrate continuity. Continuity for a future he never agreed to, Michael said. You could have grown into it. That is not consent. Victoria ignored him and faced me. North Table has earned its return. You received the purchase price, our parents regain their company, and the Price name remains where it belongs. I opened my folder and removed only 3 items. First, I placed the January catering calendar on the table. The service dates for 14 major events were clearly marked. Next, I set down the December revenue summary. The deposits for those same events had been included in the performance numbers used to support the loan. Finally, I placed the owner consent document beside them. My signature line waited at the bottom. Victoria's eyes moved across the 3 pages. I tapped the calendar. Did you tell the lender these events had not occurred? All 14 clients paid deposits. That was not my question. The bookings are secure. Several contracts allow cancellation or reduced guest counts. Did the lender know the services had not been provided? Victoria looked at Daniel instead of me. Every deposit on that report will become revenue. Daniel did not answer for her. She continued. January is one of our strongest catering months. The events will happen, the remaining balances will be paid, and the numbers will correct themselves. I picked up the pen Victoria had pushed toward me in the Brookfield kitchen. For a moment, she appeared to believe I was finally giving her what she wanted. Instead, I turned the pen around and slid it across the walnut table until it stopped in front of her. Then say it clearly, I said. Tell everyone in this room what you changed and why you need my signature before January. Victoria stared at the pen I had pushed toward her. There is nothing to confess, she said. The deposits were received in December. The events are booked, the work will be completed, and the remaining balances will come in. I moved the timing forward so the reports reflected where the company was going. Not where it was, I said. The numbers will catch up with reality in January. Daniel placed one hand on the catering calendar. His voice remained calm, which left Victoria nowhere to hide behind outrage. Can any of these 14 events be canceled? Technically, any event can be canceled. Would Price House have to return any of the deposits? Victoria hesitated. Some contracts contain refund provisions. And several clients can reduce their guest counts, I said. That does not mean they will. Daniel looked at the December report. But the lender was shown the deposits as earned revenue from services already completed, or substantially completed. Victoria's patience broke. The lender was shown money that is already in our account. Money Price House may have to give back, Daniel replied. Rosa stepped away from the wall. She had remained quiet through the ownership discussion, but now she looked directly at Victoria. If 2 weddings cancel and the university cuts its dinner in half, where does the new loan payment come from? Victoria gave her a dismissive glance. That is a management question. I work here, Rosa said. My husband's medicine comes through the insurance here. If the money is not there, what gets paid late? No one needed Daniel to explain the answer again. The monthly loan payment would come first. Vendors would shorten their terms. Payroll would become harder to cover. Insurance would become a number someone called too expensive. Victoria turned to me. You would never let that happen. The certainty in her voice silenced the room. She leaned forward, believing she had finally reached the argument that would force my hand. You can talk about risk all you want, but everyone here knows you. You did not let Price House fail 8 years ago, and you will not let it fail now. If January is weaker than projected, North Table can extend credit. If a payment is tight, you can cover it. That is what you have always done. My father nodded as if she had stated an obvious fact. My mother looked relieved. Even now, after everything, they were not asking whether the plan was safe. They were assuming I would make it safe after they signed it. Victoria continued. You own a company worth more than $100 million. This loan is not a threat to you. It is not my personal comfort that is being pledged. You control the supplier terms. You control the holding company. You can protect the employees if anything goes wrong. And that is your plan? My plan is for nothing to go wrong. No. Your plan is to take the risk, gain control, and depend on me to absorb the consequences if your projections fail. She spread her hands. Isn't protecting Price House what you wanted? That was the trap I had lived inside for most of my adult life. If I loved the restaurants, I had to repair every mistake. If I cared about the employees, I had to fund every rescue. If I refused, then whatever happened afterward would be placed at my feet instead of at the feet of the person who created the danger. I looked at the consent document, the January calendar, and the revenue summary. Then I closed the folder. You built this plan on the belief that I would clean up whatever you did, I said. That ends today. Victoria's face went still. I drew a line through my unsigned signature space. I will not approve the buyback. My mother inhaled sharply. Frank pushed himself to his feet. You cannot make that decision alone. North Table Recovery owns 62% of Price House, Daniel said. The proposed transaction requires its consent. Without that consent, the financing cannot proceed. This is still our company, my father said. You retained 38% ownership and conditional operating authority, Daniel replied. Those terms have not changed. I turned to him. Preserve every record connected to the proposed buyback, including revenue reports, catering contracts, vendor obligations, succession materials, and communications with the lender. Daniel made a note. Understood. Open an independent review. Victoria laughed once, but there was panic beneath it. You are ordering an audit because of a timing difference? I am ordering a review because you asked me to certify information that was not accurate, then admitted you expected me to cover any damage. You cannot suspend me. Your coup appointment was never approved by the majority owner. My parents appointed me. They did not have the authority to make it final. Daniel opened the operating agreement to a marked page. North Table Recovery has the right to suspend financial management authority during a review involving material representations to a lender. I did not let the conversation disappear into clauses. Effective immediately, Victoria has no authority to submit financial information, approve financing, alter vendor, payment schedules, or represent herself as COO. My sister stood. You planned this from the moment Grace complained. No. You planned it when you submitted numbers you knew, described January work as December performance. Frank struck the table with his palm. You are destroying this family over accounting language. Victoria created the consequence when she asked us to sign something that was not true. She was trying to bring Price House home. The restaurants are not a child being held hostage. They are a business employing 180 people. Margaret looked from Daniel to me. For the first time since Christmas, her fear moved beyond the family name. What happens to the employees now? The restaurants stay open, I said. Payroll continues. Insurance remains active. Existing supplier support stays in place while the review is completed. Rosa released a breath. Margaret touched my father's arm. So no one is losing a job because of this meeting. Not because I refused the loan. Frank's expression softened slightly, as though he had found the rescue he expected after all. I stopped him before he could misunderstand. I am protecting normal operations. I am not promising to erase every debt, preserve every family contract, or shield anyone from the results of the review. Vendors owned by relatives will be evaluated under the same standards as every other vendor. Victoria picked up her folder. There it is. You finally get to remove everyone who ever chose me over you. This is not about being chosen. It has always been about that. You could not have children, so you adopted Grace, built her into your heir, and waited for an excuse to replace the rest of us. Michael stood slowly. Do not use Grace again. Victoria turned toward him. We are leaving. I'm staying. I am your mother. And I am not part of your succession plan. You are choosing Evelyn over your own family. No. I am choosing not to be used by you. Victoria looked around the table for someone who would force him to follow. My father avoided her eyes. Margaret appeared too shaken to intervene. Then Victoria found the only target she still believed could carry the blame. Grace caused this, she said. She walked into our family, turned Michael against me, and gave Evelyn the excuse she had been waiting for. Grace did not create the loan, I said. She did not alter the reports, invent Michael's future, or insult herself at Christmas. She exposed a secret that tore this family apart. She refused to keep protecting the secrets of adults. Victoria's eyes hardened. No apology came. Not for the words at Christmas, not for using Michael, and not for asking employees to carry a debt built on numbers she had moved. She left the room alone. The door closed behind her, and the noise from the dining room below filled the silence. Guests were ordering coffee. Someone laughed near the staircase. Price House had survived another hour without me rushing behind the curtain to make everyone comfortable. I looked around the table, where my father had dismissed my warnings. My mother had asked Grace to preserve peace, and Victoria had counted on my money as insurance against her choices. For years, I had believed being indispensable would eventually make me loved. All it had done was make my rescue feel guaranteed. The meeting ended without reconciliation. Daniel collected the documents. My parents left together, stunned by the limits they had never expected me to enforce. Michael remained long enough to ask Rosa whether Grace had gone home safely. When the room was empty, I walked downstairs to the kitchen. The dinner rush had slowed. Rosa was checking labels in the employee refrigerator when she found a small plastic container behind a carton of cream. "Grace's bread pudding," she said. Her name was written across the lid in her careful handwriting. One portion had remained there since Christmas. Everyone had eaten from the dessert she made, but no one had thought to make sure she received her own share. I took the container from Rosa. It was cold now. The sauce settled against one side. I held it in both hands and carried it out of the restaurant. This time, I was not bringing home another problem to solve for my family. I was bringing my daughter's portion back to her. 4 months after Christmas, Price House was still open. The independent review confirmed what the 3 pages in that upstairs meeting had already shown. Deposits from January catering events had been presented as December earnings, while several vendor obligations had been pushed into the new year to make the company appear stronger than it was. The review found careless judgment, deliberate pressure, and a willingness to let future cash solve present promises. It did not find a secret fortune hidden overseas or a criminal conspiracy. Victoria had not stolen millions. She had convinced herself that moving numbers across a calendar was acceptable because the events would eventually happen, and because I would cover any shortage if they did not. That belief cost her the position she had announced at Christmas. The family buyback was canceled before the loan was signed. Price House never inherited the debt, so there were no emergency layoffs, canceled insurance plans, or suppliers demanding payment the restaurants could not make. Victoria lost the COO title and all financial management authority. She retained the small economic interest she legally owned, but she no longer controlled operations, financing, or vendor decisions. I did not remove her from the company to punish her for insulting Grace. The review removed her authority because she had submitted misleading information and expected other people to absorb the risk. Frank and Margaret kept the retirement payments guaranteed in the original restructuring agreement. They did not lose their home or their medical coverage, but they could no longer appoint relatives, approve family contracts, or treat executive positions as inheritances. For the first time, Price House began operating under rules that did not bend according to who sat at Sunday dinner. A professional restaurant manager took over daily operations. Every contract involving a relative went through the same review as an outside bid. The new governance plan included a seat for an employee representative, though the process was still being developed, and no one pretended decades of family habits could be corrected in a season. Rosa agreed to serve on the temporary employee committee. She found me one afternoon near the pastry station, reading a report about supplier pricing. Her husband had completed another round of treatment, and her insurance had remained active through every appointment. "Thank you," she said. "You kept this kitchen running for 26 years. You do not need to thank me for protecting something the company promised you." "I'm not thanking you for keeping a promise." She wiped flour from her hands. "I'm thanking you for understanding that when people move numbers, real people get moved with them." That was all she said. Rosa did not tell me I had saved Price House or call me the greatest owner the company had ever known. She returned to her dough because she had work to finish. I was grateful for that. Michael enrolled in a culinary arts program 2 counties away. Victoria told several relatives that he was wasting his future, but he stopped asking for permission to want a different one. He and Grace remained friends. They exchanged recipes, complained about knife skills assignments, and sometimes studied together at our kitchen table. There was no romance between them, and no dramatic promise to build an empire together. They were simply 2 young people learning that a family plan was not the same thing as a life. Victoria tried to apologize through Michael. She sent him a message, asking him to tell Grace that she regretted how everything had ended, and that losing her position had taught her how quickly one sentence could destroy years of work. Grace read the message once. She is sorry the sentence cost her something, she said. She is not sorry she believed it. Michael did not argue. He told his mother that if she wanted to apologize, she would have to do it herself, and without asking Grace to repair the consequences. Victoria never called. Margaret did. But she approached differently. She asked whether Grace wanted to attend a small Easter lunch. Then, before Grace answered, she added that no one would be offended if she was not ready. Grace declined. Margaret said she understood and did not ask me to change her mind. A week later, she mailed Grace a card addressed simply to Grace Price, without the phrases, "our adopted granddaughter," "Evelyn's girl," or "the child we welcomed." It was a small correction, not forgiveness. Grace placed the card in a drawer, rather than throwing it away. Frank remained more difficult. He never thanked me for saving Price House, and he continued referring to North Table's ownership as the arrangement, instead of admitting his daughter controlled the company he had nearly lost. One morning, a package appeared on our porch. Inside was the old Price House recipe ledger, the one I had used in my 20s when I calculated portions and corrected ingredient costs in the margins. Frank had added no letter. On the first page, beneath my faded handwriting, he had written only one sentence. "You always understood what kept the doors open." It was not an apology. It did not erase the years he treated my competence like disloyalty. I placed the ledger on my bookshelf because I could accept an opening without pretending it was a completed bridge. Grace submitted her culinary apprenticeship application without mentioning North Table or Price House in her personal statement. Her portfolio included photographs, cost sheets, and notes explaining how she adjusted recipes for allergies and limited budgets. I proofread for spelling only. I made no calls. The selection panel had no financial relationship with North Table, and the names of applicants were removed during the first portfolio review. When Grace reached the final interview, she did so because her work had survived without my influence. The acceptance email arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Grace read it at the kitchen counter, then read it again before allowing herself to smile. "They chose me," she said. "They did." She waited, perhaps expecting me to tell her how proud I was of everything she had overcome. Instead, I asked what she wanted for dinner. "Chicken soup," she said after a moment. "And the rolls from the foster care class." They were the first dishes we had ever made in the same room. Nothing about them belonged on a luxury menu. The soup used inexpensive chicken, carrots, celery, and noodles. The rolls were soft, uneven, and best eaten before they cooled. While the dough rested, Grace disappeared down the hallway. She returned carrying the overnight bag. She placed it on the kitchen table and opened it. One item at a time, she removed what she had packed. The toothbrush went into the bathroom cup. The charger went beside her bed. The medicine returned to the cabinet. She placed the folded clothes in her dresser and slid the copies of her documents into the household file where mine were kept. She did not burn the bag or throw it into the trash. She folded it carefully and placed it on the top shelf of the hall closet. "I might need it for the apprenticeship," she said. "Then it will be there." That evening, we ate soup at the small kitchen table. Afterward, I brought out a fresh bread pudding made from Grace's recipe. The sauce still bubbled around the edges when I placed one portion in front of her. Her hand moved automatically toward the empty containers beside the sink. She stopped. I did not tell her to keep the first piece. I did not remind her that she belonged here, or ask her to prove she believed me. Promises about safety had once been necessary, but Grace had heard enough words from adults who expected her to carry the difficult part afterward. I sat beside her and waited. She picked up the spoon. Steam rose from the warm pudding as she took the first bite before dividing anything for anyone else. Her seat at that table had not come from my 62% ownership, her talent in a kitchen, our shared last name, or the gratitude other people expected from an adopted child. It was hers because I had chosen her. At last, I had learned to make that choice louder than the false peace of everyone who wanted her to keep earning it.